I'm Brian Smith, Sony Artisan of Imagery. I was working for UPI out of Cincinnati. I volunteered to cover the Thurman Munson funeral up in Canton, Ohio, and one of the photographs from that ended up in full page in Life magazine, and that was right as I was starting journalism school, so it was sort of a good bump right at the start. And as I continued to work in newspapers, I got a job at the Orange County Register, which was kind of a great time to work there. It was a young staff. They played photographs really well. In other words, like really big. When the Olympics came to Southern California, I was one of 3 photographers from the paper who was credentialed to photograph the Olympics, and it was really a dream shoot. We worked our tails off and ended up winning the Pulitzer for our coverage that year. Well, 4 years later, actually, I was photographing the Seoul Olympics. One of the divers that I knew and had photographed a number of times was Greg Louganis, and it was at the men's springboard preliminaries where he hit his head on the diving board. And that was back in the day that most cameras, you were lucky to get 3.5 frames a second out of the motor drive. So as a consequence, compared to today where everybody's shooting 10 frames, 11 frames a second, you were kind of at the mercy of the luck of the motor drive. As it worked out, the camera caught the moment as he hit his head on the board, and that ended up becoming like one of the best known, certainly the best known sports image that I've ever taken. I love shooting news and sports, but I also didn't have much of a connection with the people that I was photographing. It's like when you're shooting football, you're shooting with a 600 millimeter lens from the sidelines or the end zone. You really don't get to know the competitors at all. So the things that I really was gravitated toward were those assignments that came up maybe a couple times a season where I would spend time one-on-one with a quarterback or one of the athletes and photograph them in a way that really revealed something of their life off of the field. And I think that became something that I enjoyed much more, is really getting to know them and creating something instead of just capturing moments. So I started gravitating that way with my freelance work. It was kind of crazy because I would shoot 5 days a week for the newspaper, and then on nights, weekends, vacation time, I would shoot for anybody from Sports Illustrated to Rolling Stone. Really, one piece of advice that I would give anyone if you want to move from one stage of your career to the next is to raise the level of your work in everything that you do. I think too many people think of like, well, when I leave the newspaper and start shooting for the magazines, then I'm gonna do better work. And that's not the best way to get there. The best way is to raise the level of your work in everything that you do. So whether I was shooting a portrait for the Miami Herald or I was off shooting for Rolling Stone, I put the same energy into each of them, and ultimately a lot of my newspaper assignments ended up in my portfolio at that time. So when you want to move to the next level, start raising the level of your work immediately. Today we're talking about shooting location portrait photography. So we're going to talk about 4 things. First off, the location itself and what the background does to enhance your shot. Second, working with your subject and how to get them to relax. Third, camera and lens selection, what works best for portraits on location. And finally, fourth, working with studio strobe on location so you can control the light. As a portrait photographer, I love shooting on location because it gives me something extra to work with. Suddenly, the background is a part of the scene instead of just a blank white canvas like you've got behind me right now. I love being able to incorporate both elements of the background with the subject, and whether that reveals more about the subject because it gives you an idea of where they're from, or it's somehow in contrast with the subject, it just adds an extra element to the photograph. A lot of the people that I photograph, I can't necessarily bring to me. I've got to go to them. I photograph a lot of celebrities at home, on set. Wherever they want me is where I go. So when I have a chance to pick the location, a lot of times it starts with where we're going to do the shoot. I'm a big advocate to getting in early and scouting. So if I'm photographing a CEO or a star or something, if I can go there the day before and look around the scene. One of the things that you can do to kind of tweak things is look for that shot that is unusual. So whenever I'm shooting CEOs, it's the last place in the world that I want to shoot typically is their office. It's like there's so many pictures of CEOs at their desk. Like obviously they've got the biggest desk in the place, but that's not really that interesting. Sometimes I've photographed them on loading docks, on the production line, wherever we can, where it kind of gets them in a little bit more of an element, maybe even where the end product is used, finding something that's different and maybe they haven't been photographed before. Also, if you can do something that's kind of interesting for them, even if you've got them for 15 minutes, if they can be interested in and engaged for that 15 minutes of time, it's always better than getting somebody who's bored with the process. If I'm shooting on a set, I may not necessarily shoot right in the middle of the set because it's breaking everything up, but I'm looking for that, something that reveals something about the filmmaking process, just something that catches my eye. If you're shooting on a film set, it's always good to kind of pick something where you're not in the way, because typically a lot of times you're going to get the talent at a 5-minute break between scenes. So if you can do that where you're out of everybody's way, sometimes that 5 minutes becomes 15. So going in early, seeing what really strikes my eye. Generally, I'm looking for something relatively clean, but with some interest in it as well. So you're not looking for necessarily the most distracting background, but you want something that enhances the photograph as well. I had a call from Sony. They were partnering up with a creative coalition to do a project to support arts and arts education. Over those 3 days, we photographed 60 actors and actresses, and then they would write their handwritten thoughts about what the arts means to them in a journal. And I think it was the combination of those two that they were forced to kind of think about what the arts means to them, that everybody came in with a really great attitude, because just as if you're a photographer, you're very passionate about what you do, they're passionate about the arts. And one of the things that happened would be a lot of people would be taken back to that moment that they saw their first Broadway play, or they were in their first high school musical. And it really opened things up where this was not about the agenda of the magazine, it wasn't about the agenda of their studio or the photographer's agenda. It really was about them expressing what the arts means to them. And I think that's a lesson that I learned, is because typically we at the most had 15 minutes with the subject. A lot of times it would be 5 minutes, and just putting them in a frame of mind where they feel completely at ease. We were in very small rooms on most of these things, so it was great. You know, there was no big team of people in the background, and I wanted to keep it simple. So the options were either white, gray, or black. We ended up going with a charcoal gray behind everybody just to give it a cohesive feel, kept the lighting the same all the way through, same background all the way through, because I didn't want the readers to notice he's now using kicker lights behind the subject, he's changed it around, he's gone to a white background, the light is now harsh. I wanted really the subject to stand out. I didn't want people to notice all the different tricks that I can do with lighting. I just wanted nice, clean light on everybody, so it's their expression, how they happen to feel that particular day really came through, and it showed their personality, not what I can do with the camera. So whenever you're doing multiple images, that's a great idea to really standardize your approach so the images hold together. And that actually played off really well, because after our initial 3 days shooting in Los Angeles, everyone decided we had to keep this thing going. So we went to New York, set up in studio. We even dragged our backdrops to Tony Bennett's apartment on Central Park. We were able to replicate the look that we had in the original shots. And I think that's one of the keys, is not binding yourself in a way that everything has to be shot in a huge soundstage. I guess in a way we were lucky that our first images were shot in a 8 by 10 foot bedroom. After that, everything was a piece of cake, because we knew, like even shooting in a hotel suite, we could move the bed out of the way and we had enough space to replicate it. So sometimes keeping your setup very simple and minimalistic makes it that much easier to match images later in the future. It's always a great luxury to go back and photograph someone you photographed before, but the reality, a lot of the people that I'm shooting, it may be the first time that I've ever met them. So I try to learn a little bit about them. It could be from the CEO, I'm finding out from his assistant, like some dirt on him, something that we can talk about. With any type of people in the arts, you can always do Google searches and find a ton of information. But I'm not looking for the really typical thing that, for instance, their filmography, they've talked about that so much. I'm looking for the thing that's unusual, like it may be where they grew up, it may be a hobby or a talent that people don't normally associate with them. We could even just be talking about what was the first thing that inspired them when they got into the arts. And those moments of awakening, instead of thinking about like, oh, gee, I've got to do publicity for my new film, suddenly they're transported to the moment that their love and passion for the arts was awakened. So I think with anyone that you're photographing, getting them to a point where they're thinking about something that's very pleasurable for them just puts them in the right frame of mind. So a lot of times when I'm photographing high-profile people, whether they're CEOs or actors, I love it when I get an hour with somebody, but the reality is a lot of times I'm shooting in 30 minutes, 15 minutes, sometimes 5 minutes on a shoot. And that's an instance where you really want to be completely ready when your subject shows up. So it really pays off. You get in there early, scout, figure out exactly what you want to do. A lot of times we'll pre-light 2 different situations, so the subject stands in for a minute or 2 in one situation, we move them on to the next. And I've done 5-minute shoots where we've gotten 3 setups done that way. Also, remember to move in and out. That's another way. It's like editors love to have a lot of choices. So if I'm shooting somebody full body, a lot of times I'll come in and try to do a headshot. If I'm shooting a headshot, I back off and put a little bit of space around the person just for that different point of view. It's really important to know your gear. Just like a musician who practices their scales on and on and on, it's like knowing what your gear is going to do before you get out on a shoot allows you just to really concentrate on what's in front of your lens, not the menu settings on your camera. So spend the time to get to know what all the menu settings do, figure out how your lights work, everything like that. So the moment you've got someone in front of a camera, all of your attention, every bit of it, is focused on them, not on how to set things up or settings you want to change. They should be like muscle memory. You should just jump into the changes that you want to get the effect that you need. 3 keys to a successful portrait shoot is get there early to scout, set up and pre-light so when your subject shows up, you're ready to go, and know your gear so all of your attention is focused on your subject. My go-to gear these days, I'm shooting with the A7R Mark II. I love that camera. It's got high resolution, it's got image stabilization, it's got a back illuminated sensor. Typically though, I'm shooting at ISO 100, the base ISO, but I also know if I'm shooting in low light and have to crank that to 12,000 or 25,000, the back illuminated technology allows me to capture fine detail without getting much noise. So it's really the camera that does it all. The 3 lenses that I kept hearing from pros that they wanted for the A7 series were a 24-70 2.8, a 70-200 2.8, and an 85 1.4. I wanted to see them match the performance of Sony's A-mount Zeiss lenses that I really love. And so far shooting with the 24-70 2.8 and 85 1.4 G Master, I was very pleasantly surprised that they didn't merely match the performance of the benchmark that Sony set with A-mount, but they actually exceeded the performance of Zeiss lenses. My absolute favorite lens to shoot portraits is a 24-70. If I had to shoot with one lens, that's the lens I use. Because that 24-70 gives me the ability to shoot everything from at 24 millimeters, I'm not doing a tight portrait, I'm shooting typically a full body shot with a lot of environment around the subject. And then if I zoom in at 45, 50 millimeters is just perfect for half body, or if I'm gonna do a tight portrait, a lot of times I love shooting at 70 millimeters. It's a little bit shorter than the traditional 85, 100, 135, but that means that you're closer and get a more intimate shot of the subject. So instead of standing way back and shouting directions, we're just having a quiet conversation, and I can tell them just turn a little bit more to the left, and it just gives the reader a feel that they're right in at an intimate moment with the subject instead of being distant from them. So 24 to 70 really gives me everything from that wide angle to very tight. If you let me have a second, the next lens that I would add in is the FE85 1.4 G Master, because it gives you that classic headshot portrait look where you can shoot a tight portrait with a little bit more flattening to the scene. So it doesn't have quite the same intimate feel that you would have at 70 millimeters, but those times you really want to flatten off the perspective a bit for a tight portrait. 85 is perfect, and having a lens that is razor sharp, wide open, with no chromatic aberration, it's the best 85 that I've ever shot. And honestly, those two lenses for a portrait photographer, that takes care of 95% of what I shoot. Be very happy shooting with an A7R II and those two lenses. Typically, I will take other gear just in case it's something out of that range. The other lens that I'll almost always have in a kit with me is the 90 millimeter f2.8 macro. It's a G lens, but I honestly think it should have been the original G Master because it's that sharp. DxO rated it the sharpest 90 to 100 millimeter macro ever made, and I totally believe that. It's incredibly sharp, and what that has an advantage is macro doesn't typically just mean when you're shooting bugs or things one-to-one. It means that it's optimized for the close range as opposed to infinity. And a lot of times if I'm doing a headshot, the close range, it might be 1 to 5 or 1 to 6 is absolutely exceptional. And it's a lens that when you're shooting tighter and tighter, you never hit the minimum focus when you're doing a portrait. So suddenly we can be going from right here to in this tight, and I know that it will hold focus even as I'm getting closer and closer. So that's a lens that I love as well. Probably the number one thing that I recommend people as soon as they buy a camera is get an external battery charger, or better yet, two, and 2 to 3 to 4 extra batteries. And the batteries are really small. Throw them in your pocket and stop complaining about battery life. We're here at Freestyle Fighting Academy. I'm photographing mixed martial artist Edgar Plazola. And for the first thing that I look for as I walk into a shot is just really an interesting backdrop. First thing that caught my eyes was this whole lineup of bags here. But what I really liked is they had what's essentially back here like a bunch of tires. So for a first shot, I've got him pounding away on the tires. I thought that'd be a great way to start. I've got my Sony A7R Mark II, and I'm lighting using ProPhoto Strobes. So I've got a couple of cute strobes and trying to give it, in this case, kind of an edgy look. For ISO, I always go with the native ISO of the camera. With the Sony A7 series cameras, it's ISO 100. I go with 100 because it's the best quality and I can control my light output. So I know 100 is going to be enough. The first thing I always do is lock down the aperture with the output of the strobe. Typically, if I'm doing a portrait, I'm going to look for like the middle of the range from 5.6 to maybe f11. So if I'm getting f11 from the strobe, it doesn't matter if I'm shooting at a 30th of a second or 1/125th, the f-stop is still going to be f11. That allows me to use the shutter speed to control the brightness of the background. So if I'm shooting at a 60th of a second and the background is too bright, I can go up to 1/125th of a second and basically darken the background by a stop. Every shutter speed that you go slower will double the amount of light, and you can control it in third stops all the way down. So you can get the background to look just the way that you want. If I've got an active subject, I'm usually shooting at the max sync speed of the camera, 1/125th, 1/160th, somewhere in that range. And then that gives them ability to move some. They're still going to be frozen by the flash, because the flash goes off, it's very bright. So even if there's slight movement, they're going to be frozen by the flash exposure. But if somebody is seated in a chair and we're doing a portrait shoot, I can be shooting as slow as a second or two to burn in a background. I'll just warn the subject just to stay put and wait for the end of the exposure. One setting that I think is really important if you're new to mirrorless cameras, one of the really cool things with Sony's EVF is with the live view setting effect on, you can see what the camera sees. So if you have the camera set for 1/125th at f11 at ISO 100, the EVF will show you exactly what that scene looks like. A lot of people, if they're used to an optical viewfinder, are kind of freaked out with the what you see is what you get exposure. But once you start shooting with it, it's really difficult to ever go back to not having that input as you shoot. So with live view setting effect on, I see in real time what the camera's capturing, which is really great when you're shooting outdoors, want to see the exposure in real time, but not so great if you're shooting in a dark studio or nightclub or something that's really dark and you have a lot of artificial light coming in from the side. So if I've got strobes kicking out f11 in a dark club, I change live view setting effect to off, and then your LCD and EVF will act just like an optical viewfinder, which allows you to see not in real time what the exposure is, but just an average view of the scene. As a portrait photographer, my favorite focus method is to set the focus area to flexible spot and put that flexible spot right over the face or right over the eye. There's actually a really easy way to do this. Go into your custom menu settings under custom key settings. Select center button and change that to standard. Once you do this, by pressing the center button, it activates the center wheel to adjust your focus point. So you can press right or left, up or down, put that focus area right over the subject's eye or the subject's face. One of the things that I'm looking for is that the lighting gives the feel that you might have in an arena. So I'm using hard lights, which is the great thing with studio strobes. I'm using those with a 12-inch reflector, very similar to what you'd see at the top of the arena. Just gives it a little bit more of an edge as opposed to coming in with a big octabank from the side that's going to seem more like diffused window light. Working with artificial light allows me to really set the light that I want and have it constant. Were these on the cars of one of the guys you beat? Studio strobes can be 600 watt second, 1200 watt second, or 2400 watt second. Typically, I'm always locked down at ISO 100. I can vary the output, but I have those set for manual just because I want the output to be constant. I don't need TTL. I set it up, and as long as the light stays the same distance from the subject, I'm going to continue to get f11. I trigger them off with like real old school pocket wizards. A lot of times I'm also trying to maybe enhance the look that's already there. So if we have a big open sky in one direction, I'm just bringing in a big bank of light from that same direction, just really to make the subject pop a little bit. It's not necessarily to change the look of the light, but I'm kind of burning and dodging in camera. I want to make the subject just a little bit brighter than the background, and working with studio strobe allows me to do that on location. The other great thing about working with artificial light is your exposure is set. I want to be able to choose the depth of field that looks right to me. So I use studio strobe that if I want f11, I've got f11 all the way through. I usually kind of go for those middle f-stops, not too wide open, like at 1.4, where if the subject moves slightly, focus is off, but I also don't want to have the lens stopped all the way down to 16 or 22 because I don't need the background to be tight. I just need enough room that the subject stays in focus whether they're moving forward or back. It really simplifies things. I'm not constantly changing apertures or shutter speeds in the middle of the shoot. There's a cohesive look throughout. I can still keep shooting. Usually when I'm shooting at location, I'm probably at 300 watt seconds to 600 watt seconds to be able to get an output of 11 and a half, which is just about right for me. That tends to work perfectly when I'm syncing somewhere around 1/160th of a second at ISO 100. So totally old school, it just works. So on location portraits, one of the things that a lot of people don't think about is the fact that the EVF and being able to review images through the electronic viewfinder is actually a godsend when shooting in bright sunny conditions, whether you're here in Miami with like strong overhead light or at the beach or something like that. It's always a very difficult thing. You're looking at the LCD on the back and you can barely see the image and you just hope it's there. Being able to look through an electronic viewfinder and review the images that way, or even something as simple as seeing the camera settings very clearly that way, makes life that much easier. I also shoot a lot of black and white, and even though I shoot RAW when I do black and white and do my conversions later, I can set the camera for RAW plus JPEG and select a camera profile that shows me in real time black and white. So if I'm shooting a scene and want to kind of preview how the image is going to look in black and white, whatever contrast range I want, whatever sharpness I want, sort of pre-visualize in real time what those black and white images are going to do. As I was making the transition, even from Sony's A-mount cameras like the Alpha 900 to the original mirrorless, the NEX5, sometimes I would pick up one of my A900s, stare at the LCD, and then I'd realize, oh, there's no live view. Also, sometimes if I'm doing a portrait shoot and we lock the camera down on a tripod, I can interact with the subject and still see in real time the image without having to put my eye against the camera. I think one of the best things about mirrorless cameras in general, but the Sony A7 series in particular, is the ability to mount almost any lens ever made. I love Sony lenses for the sharpness, but there's times where you may not necessarily want something razor sharp, and if you're looking for a 50-year-old single-coated lens or an even older lens with no coatings on it to give you a soft image straight in camera rather than in Photoshop, the ability to put all of this different glass on your camera and create different looks in camera is a huge plus. And Sony gives me all those things that I'm looking for in a camera. It's got high resolution, they offer things like image stabilization. So I shoot handheld a lot, and being able to make sure that there's no camera movement in the images and having it built into the chip. So even if I'm shooting with a 50-year-old Leica lens, I'm getting image stabilization that I would not have gotten on the camera that lens was made for. To me, the thing that I love about mirrorless is all the technology that it affords you. You can see in real time what the scene looks like, be able to review in the EVF if you wish, so you're not chimping back and forth between looking through the viewfinder and then down at an LCD. So you're shooting very quickly. It offers things like focus peaking. Because of how thin the bodies are, they're what I consider almost a universal lens mount, because by using lens adapters, you can pretty much mount any full frame lens that's ever been made, even lenses that are 100 years old. Somebody probably has made a lens adapter that allows you to repurpose those glass and shoot something totally different in camera. So thanks for joining me on this location portrait shoot. Hopefully everything we went over today now makes sense. It all begins with your location, picking your background to enhance your shot, then learning how to work with your subject and make them relax, picking the right camera and lenses, and learning that gear so the focus goes back on your subject. And finally, what working with studio strobes can do to allow you to control the look of the shot. The one thing that you can do to make yourself a better portrait photographer is get more people in front of your lens. The best advice I was ever given was, if you want to be a good portrait photographer, go out and do portraits of 50 strangers. Approach people on the street, find out what makes them tick, and do a portrait that reveals something about who they are, not just where they are. So find a subject, pick a great background, and get out there and take some great location portraits.